The evening sun bled itself thin across the western sky, its last fire painting the horizon in bruised streaks of orange and violet. The yard before the Dawson ranch sat quiet but for the creak of a loose shutter and the scrape of boots in the dust. In that half-light stood Clara Mae Dawson, hair hacked uneven, soot streaking her face where her in-laws had pressed ash against her skin with the cruel glee of those who sought to humble another. She did not weep, not outwardly. The tears she swallowed burned her throat, her hands trembling at her sides, fists clenching and unclenching as though searching for courage that had long since been stripped away. Her late husband's family gathered nearby like a pack of vultures, their laughter sharp as broken glass. They called her a burden, whispered she was dead weight now that Thomas was in the ground. They had tolerated her presence long enough, they said, but she had no claim to food, no right to shelter. The cutting of her hair had not been punishment alone but a declaration. She would be made into nothing, her pride ground to dust beneath their boots. She was no longer a Dawson in their eyes, merely an orphaned mouth that demanded feeding. The neighbors watched from porches and fence rails, faces pale in the twilight. Some shifted uneasily, but none intervened. To stand against the Dawsons was to invite ruin. So silence reigned, silence and shame, broken only by Clara's soft gasp when her sister-in-law shoved her to her knees, the ashes on her face mixing with dirt until she felt herself more ghost than woman. It was then that a shadow separated itself from the line of wagons at the far edge of the yard. Ezekiel Carver, Zeke to those who dared speak his name aloud, moved with the unhurried steadiness of a man accustomed to solitude. Tall, broad-shouldered, weathered by years of working land that gave little, he was known as a recluse, whispered to be half-wild, more at ease with horses and silence than with any human soul. His reputation kept most at a distance, for folk feared what they did not understand, and Zeke Carver had long been a mystery. He stood there for a moment, hat low, eyes shadowed. Clara could not see his expression, only the way his hands flexed near the brim as though he fought against the impulse to act. When her brother-in-law spat near her boots and declared her less than a mule, Zeke's voice finally cut through the air. "You're coming with me." The words dropped heavy, like iron on stone. The yard fell still. Laughter died in throats. Even the cicadas seemed to hush. Clara lifted her head, stunned, meeting the outline of his figure through her tears. He was not close enough to touch, yet she felt the reach of his presence like a shield raised against the storm. Her in-laws broke into mocking jeers. "You want her, Carver? She's yours then. Nothing but trouble. You'll see quick enough." Their cruelty turned into entertainment, a show made better by an unexpected actor. Clara's lips parted but no sound came. She wanted to refuse, to say she could not leave with a stranger, that she feared what life he might lead her into. Yet her voice failed, caught in the snare of humiliation and the faint, flickering hope that maybe, just maybe, this was deliverance. Zeke stepped forward, slow but unyielding, and extended his hand. He did not force it upon her, did not demand obedience. He offered, as one might offer water to the parched. The hush of the crowd deepened, for they understood something unusual was unfolding. Clara stared at the hand, rough with calluses, steadied by years of toil. She thought of her husband's hands, once warm, later cold in death, and of the hands that had just cut her hair, smeared her face, pushed her into the dirt. Trembling, she lifted her own and placed it lightly in his, uncertain if she was leaping from one cage into another or stepping at last into open air. Gasps rose among the onlookers. Whispers darted quick as sparrows. "She's runnin' with the mad rancher. Best rid of her anyway. He'll regret it by sunrise." Zeke ignored them all, turning his body so it shielded Clara from their stares. With quiet resolve, he guided her away, his stride steady, his silence louder than any defense he might have spoken. The crowd parted reluctantly, eyes following them as though they bore witness to scandal wrapped in mystery. Clara felt their judgment like stones hurled at her back. Yet each step she took beside Zeke lessened the weight, until the Dawson house and its bitter laughter lay behind them in shadow. They reached his horse tied at the fence. He lifted her up without a word, then swung into the saddle behind. The ride stretched into silence, the rhythm of hooves on dirt the only sound. Clara sat stiff, ashamed of her shorn hair, her face still smeared. The night air cooled her skin, carrying the scent of sage and dust. At last, Unable to bear the quiet, she whispered, "Why did you do it?" Her voice was small, almost lost to the wind. Zeke did not look at her. His gaze stayed fixed on the horizon where stars gathered in their endless vigil. "Didn't sit right," he said, voice low, rough as gravel. "Seeing you left in the dirt. That was all. No sermon, no promise. Just plain truth laid bare." And somehow it steadied her more than any vow could have. They rode on until the Dawson place was a memory behind them, and only open land stretched ahead. Clara pressed a hand against her chest where her heart hammered, uncertain if she belonged to herself any more or if she had been claimed by another fate altogether. She wondered if she should fear the man whose silence spoke louder than words, or if she should trust the hand that had lifted her when all others pressed her down. The stars thickened overhead, cool light brushing the land in silver. Clara tilted her head back, closing her eyes, letting the wind carry away the taste of ash still clinging to her lips. She felt the weight of her humiliation, but beneath it, faint as a new flame, stirred the question of whether dignity could be reclaimed. When Zeke's ranch house finally loomed in the distance, a dark silhouette against the night, Clara shivered. This was no ending, she knew, but a passage. She had been taken from the dust, yet what awaited her within those walls she could not guess. As the horse slowed, she drew a long breath, steeling herself. The echo of his words lingered in her mind, a tether both terrifying and strange. "You're coming with me." And though fear still clung to her ribs, a part of her, small but stubborn, hoped those words might mean more than rescue. Perhaps they meant she had not yet been erased from this world. Perhaps they meant her story was only just beginning. Night had settled deep over the prairie when Clara first stepped across the threshold of Ezekiel Carver's house. The cabin was plain but solid, walls smelling faintly of pine resin and smoke. A single lamp glowed on the table, throwing shadows across shelves lined with practical things. Tools carefully ordered, tin cups, a folded quilt. There was no woman's touch anywhere, no flowers, no lace, only the stillness of a place built to keep a man alive and nothing more. Clara stood uncertain in the doorway, her torn shawl clutched tight around her shoulders, her breath uneven as the strangeness of this refuge pressed in. She did not feel safe exactly, but she felt unseen by the cruel eyes that had tormented her, and that was something like mercy. Zeke set a kettle on the stove without a word. His movements were measured, unhurried, as though he had long ago learned that silence could carry as much meaning as speech. Clara took a seat at the table, fingers drifting toward the rough wood where she traced the grain, grounding herself in its solidity. When he placed a tin cup before her, steam rising faintly, she murmured thanks. He only nodded, his eyes steady, watchful but not prying. She drank, the bitter warmth filling her chest, and for the first time in days her trembling eased. In the mirror above the washbasin, she later glimpsed her reflection. Hair hacked uneven, face scrubbed clean but red from harsh cloth. She startled at the sight, as if a stranger stared back, shorn, shamed, but alive. Her breath caught, tears threatening. Then, on the edge of the table, she noticed a folded kerchief Zeke had left there. No words accompanied it, but the gesture pierced her like sunlight through cloud. She pressed it to her face, drawing strength from the quiet kindness that expected nothing in return. The days that followed moved slowly, measured by the rhythm of ranch work. Zeke rose before dawn, his boots sounding steady on the cabin floor, and Clara found herself rising too. She cooked simple meals, though her hands shook at first, afraid he would judge. But he ate without comment, nodding once as if to say it was enough. She offered to help with the horses, fumbling with reins and brushes, her motions clumsy beside his skill. Yet he never laughed, never scolded. Instead, he guided her hands with a patience that disarmed her. The animals responded to his gentleness, their dark eyes reflecting a trust she began to recognize. In him, she saw not wildness but restraint, a man who had chosen solitude not from madness but from an unwillingness to be ruled by cruelty. Still, gossip traveled faster than the wind. Clara heard it in town when Zeke rode with her to trade for supplies. Whispers clung to them like burrs. Carver's taken in the widow Dawson. Poor fool doesn't know the weight he's carrying. Women looked at her with pity edged sharp by scorn, men muttered about scandal. Clara felt herself shrink beneath their gaze, shame flaring fresh. Yet Zeke, standing beside her with a sack of flour on his shoulder, only said, "Let him talk." His eyes flicked to hers then, steady as stone, and she realized he meant it. Their words did not rule him. And slowly, she wondered if they had to rule her either. For the first time, she began to breathe without constant fear. She mended her shawl by lamplight, swept the cabin floor, fed the chickens. They were small tasks, but they felt like steps toward belonging. Zeke spoke little, yet in the way he set an extra chair by the fire, in how he left wood stacked neatly at the door before she thought to ask, she understood he was building space for her, one quiet act at a time. It might have continued this way, a slow weaving of silence into trust, if not for the storm that broke one evening. Rain lashed the earth, thunder rolling over the plains like a drum of war. Clara was tending the lamp when pounding shook the door. She froze, dread prickling. Zeke opened it to find her in-laws, faces red with drink, voices slurred with anger. They demanded she return, claiming she was theirs to command, sneering that she had no right to remain here. Clara's breath seized in her chest. Old fear clutched her spine. She waited for Zeke to step aside, to hand her over, for even he could not wish to shoulder the weight of her disgrace. But instead, he stood unmoving in the doorway, his body a wall between her and the men who had cut her down. His voice was low, steady as the rain hammering the roof. "She doesn't belong to you. Not anymore." They cursed, threatened, stepping forward as though to force him aside. Lightning flared, throwing their twisted expressions into sharp relief. Clara trembled, heart pounding, expecting violence. But Zeke did not raise his fists. He only planted himself firmer, the storm behind him, his stillness more dangerous than rage. The men hesitated, unsettled by his calm, but pressed again, shouting insults, daring her to speak. And then, against the trembling of her knees, Clara did. Her voice cracked at first, then found a steadier ground. "I will not go back," she said, each word pulled from the deepest well of herself. "I'd rather have nothing than crawl in your dust again." The room fell silent but for the rain. The men glared, spit curses, and at last retreated into the storm, their defeat cloaked in bitterness. Clara sagged, her body quaking, tears burning her eyes. She expected Zeke to rebuke her weakness, but instead he closed the door, set the bolt firm, and looked at her with a quiet that steadied more than any embrace. "Took courage to stand," he said simply. She pressed her hands to her face, choking back sobs. "I don't know who I am anymore," she whispered. Zeke shook the rain from his hat, setting it aside. His reply came plain, unadorned, but heavier than iron. "Then you'll find out. No hurry." Those words wrapped around her like a cloak, not of rescue but of recognition. He was not telling her who to be. He was giving her the space to become. That night, after the storm passed and the stars returned, she stepped outside, gazing upward. The sky spread vast and jeweled, endless as possibility. For the first time in her life, she felt not erased but seen, not worthless but waiting. The lamp glowed behind her, Zeke moving within the cabin, steady as always. She drew a deep breath, letting the night air fill her lungs. The memory of ashes and laughter still clung, but beneath it pulsed something stronger, the fragile beginning of self-worth. She had been claimed not as property, but as a person worth protecting, worth believing in. And though fear had not vanished, hope now stood beside it. The prairie wind swept her hair, short and uneven though it was, and she lifted her chin into the starlight. She thought of the words that had begun her journey, "You're coming with me," and realized they had carried more than escape. They had carried the chance to stand, to reclaim dignity, to begin again. And she knew, with the quiet certainty of a woman reborn, that her story had not ended in shame but had only just begun to rise from the dust.